Okay. Welcome to everyone joining this book launch for Susan Hawthorne's new release of Biopolitics, Feminism, Globalisation and Biodiversity. We respectfully acknowledge the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their custodianship of the lands and waterways. The lands on which Spinifex offices are situated are Giru, where Susan and I am, Bunurong and Wurundjeri, Wadawurrung, Eora and Noongar. We also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. Now, what's going to happen? Susan is first going to say a few words about how the original version of Biopolitics came into being. And after that, Prue Hyman from New Zealand will speak. And after Prue, Diane Bell from Canberra will speak. And I'll introduce them when their turn comes. So let me start with Susan Hawthorne, who, of course, nobody knows Susan Hawthorne. So Susan Hawthorne joined the women's liberation movement in 1973. She quickly volunteered at Melbourne's Rape Crisis Centre and was active in student politics. She has organised writers' festivals, been an aerialist in 2 women's circuses, and written on topics as broad as war, friendship with animals, very important, and mythic traditions. She writes non-fiction, fiction, and poetry, and her books have been translated into multiple languages. She has taught English to Arabic-speaking women, worked in Aboriginal education, and had teaching roles across a number of subject areas in universities, including philosophy, women's studies, literature, publishing studies, and creative writing. Currently, she's adjunct professor in the School of Humanities at James Cook University in Townsville. And her latest books are Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, 2020, The Sacking of the Muses, 2019, and Dark Matters, 2017. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Renate. I just want to begin by saying that I am living and working on Giru land, Giru country, and I pay my respects to the Indigenous owners of the land across Australia, but particularly in this particular area. I want to begin by saying as how the original book came about. I happened to go to a wonderful conference in Bangladesh, which was organised by Farida Akhtar. It was a conference called People's Perspectives on Population. And at that conference were 64 women, and we sat in a room. We split into groups, as feminists usually do. We spent 4 days 4 days talking to one another. I happened to be in a group that was led by Maria Meads, and I learned a lot of things then that I had never heard of. I did not know about structural adjustment programs. I didn't know anything much about free trade. I'd heard about it, but I wasn't particularly interested. But over the days, I came to understand that these were important feminist issues. And on the second last day of the conference, I sat under a tree and wrote out a 3-page manifesto called Biopolitics, a Manifesto. And when I read it out, both Maria and Jenna Correa said I had to say more. I had to build this up possibly into a book. I had no idea how I could do that. It's one thing to write down what comes into your head and put it out on paper, but to actually prove or give evidence for my ideas was really something. And I also have to acknowledge Renate, because without her I would not have been at this conference. One of the things, so that was 1993, and I finished writing it at the beginning of 2002. I had to learn a lot in between. I had to teach myself something about economics, Thank you, Prue, and many others. But it was basically built on 30 years of feminist theorising and practice. And I have been involved over a long period of time in different organisations and so forth. The basic argument of the book is a world structured from the ground up, from grassroots through a wild politics founded on a culture inspired by biodiversity, could lead Western global culture away from the vicious cycles of violence that are perpetrated in international politics, in communities and inside family homes. As we travelled through the countryside of Bangladesh, I was overwhelmed by the rich fertility of the land. I grew up on dry land, very dry land farm in the Riverina. The contrast could not have been sharper, but all I'd heard about Bangladesh was all about poverty. I was to find a great deal of richness at the conference. As I said, I was inspired to learn about economics, to read up on the intricacies of free trade rules, to rethink my way through ideas about land as possession and land as relationship, and to find ways to compare farming, fishing and forestry industries in countries far removed from one another but facing many of the same problems. And to ask why it is that overpopulation is blamed for our troubles when really it is overconsumption and the push for the production drive that is far more suspect as the origins of the problems of our planet. I finished the book with a chapter called Wild Politics, a vision for the next 40,000 years, which draws on the work of Lilla Watson, a Murray artist from southern Queensland, also a theorist and activist, whom I'd heard speak in 1984 at the Women and Labour Conference. And I found her idea of a 40,000 year plan really interesting, because if you're going to plan for that far ahead, you have to do more than just think about the next decade. And you know, we're lucky if our governments manage to think 3 years ahead. So thinking about the future in that way is, I think, really quite extraordinary. So now I think Prue is going to speak. So that's why I wrote the book. And I mean, it did take me a long time, but it was fun in a way.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was really good. And I fondly remember that conference and how important it was for all of us. So now it'd be my pleasure to invite Prue Hyman from New Zealand. Now, where are you, Prue? Are you there somewhere?
I'm here.
Yeah, okay, great. Now, Prue Hyman is a lesbian feminist activist, and for many years was a feminist economics academic at Victoria University in Wellington. Her areas of research span feminist economic theory, labour force participation, the position of older women in international issues, as well as writing on lesbians. She is the author of Women and Economics, Critical Reading for Feminists. She has worked as a consultant to the New Zealand Ministry of Women's Affairs, helped organise the New Zealand Women's Studies Association, and been on the board of the International Association for Feminist Economics. Aging and therefore impatient to achieve positive changes, her retired status allows her to be much more trenchant on the shameful status of on the shameful errors committed by orthodox neoclassical economics. She is active in the Living Wages campaign. Thank you very much, Prue.
Well, thank you, Renate. Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings from New Zealand. First, I want to pay a major tribute to Susan. She has an amazing breadth of knowledge. The book took my breath away when I first read it. weaving together so many strands in a book of real hope amongst the despair at the world as it is. What humanity could achieve, if only. Susan's done so much, written so much, published so much via Spinifex, with, of course, Renate. So many inspiring authors, including novels by my late partner, Pat Rosier, which I just wanted to mention, and been a circus performer and leader to boot. She takes my breath away. The book has a 51-page bibliography and a 20-page index. Not to show off, but showing the immense amount she's read and drawn on across the world, generously attributing so many ideas to wonderful feminists. I can't remember if it was the first time I met Susan at a New Zealand Women's Studies Association conference, probably in the 1980s. She gave a paper with the genesis of the ideas of wild politics. I told her she was a feminist economist. She was a bit taken aback and slightly flattered. She's written an inspiring book. I'm quoted on the back cover, and I can't put it better than reading it out. That the book is drawing on feminist and indigenous knowledge to critique global capitalist practice and create a vision of a regenerative world sustaining the environment and its people. And if that's a bit hard to take in, inside the back cover is a large banner, "Don't return to normal." That is perfectly easy to take in, and what we should indeed appreciate. We don't want to return to normal. And it's very appropriate to think about that in a time of COVID, of Russian ruining Ukraine, killing its people, whatever your analysis of the war, and restricting the supply of grain to the poorest people of the world. We don't want to return to normal. All the governments of the rich world want is to get back to normal, instead of using the lessons of COVID, for example, to rethink the ways we do things. After all, China's draconian approach drastically reduced pollution in Shanghai and Beijing. We have to think about just how those things can help us, in fact. All the debate in New Zealand and Australia is over the resulting high inflation, interest rates, shortages, conventional GDP measures. Very little on what has to happen to protect the poorest groups in society. In New Zealand, we've taken 25 cents off the tax for petrol, and that's supposed to achieve a miracle. Governments are floundering, and women, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and the working class generally, I still proudly use that term, are suffering. Inequalities widen further, and internationally it's even worse. Who gets the COVID vaccinations? Not the third world. Susan's preface to the 2022 edition, 20 years on, points out that some things have stayed the same, some got worse, and a very, very few perhaps got better. It's depressing how few of the ideas have been taken up, despite the numbers of people and groups pushing for them. And of course, it's all a matter of power. Who has the power? The fact they won't give it up, which is well analysed in the book, of course. And in most countries, depressingly few people are pushing for a revolution. Of course, they've got to flipping well just manage to keep body and soul together. They don't have the energy to push for a revolution, most of us. One thing which Susan doesn't pay much attention to is the role of the media, and now the social media, in all this. How can we get control of it? I don't really have the answers, but I think it's an important question. For us radical feminists, and some of us lesbian feminists, many things have got worse. Woman is a threatened word and concept. Sex and gender are confounded. The trans extremist lobby's success means, among other indignities, that men can be in women's prisons, and violent statistics by sex become meaningless. How can we get real change to male bad behaviour when we don't even know how much of it there is? Counting trans women as women in such statistics is obscene. It's bad enough the undercount because women are too afraid to report violence. Then, of course, there's Roe v. Wade. My God, what's happening in the US? Leaves those of us in slightly better off New Zealand and Australia almost speechless. But not really. We've got to fight on with the Americans. And Afghanistan women can't even go to school. The backlash is all too real, and much of the fourth and fifth wave of feminism, or whatever the hell wave we've got to, is not equipped to deal with it. Then in the 20 years, we've had an increased awareness of the dangers to the planet from climate change. Awareness, yes, but positive action to combat it glacially slow. You've got enough climate issues at the moment. We have too. But nothing as bad as the Pacific Islands. Susan's preface has some optimism about forestry, farming and fishing changing their ways, but land clearing and deforestation proceeds apace. In a country like New Zealand, where cows abound and their waste products pollute the water and yield massive emissions, optimism isn't very justified. Governments are too scared of the farming lobbies and worried about export earnings to do much to change things. Now, I'm just a humble feminist economist, and the concepts of wild politics and biodiversity are a bit beyond me, but I find them very exciting. Susan says that wild politics is both an analysis of structural forces and a strategy for resistance. It takes into consideration the local and the personal, measuring the impact of those on the global and local environments. A new paradigm for thinking about the macro and micro worlds. It affects every aspect of life, including human relationships to the natural world, the wild world, to one another, to culture, to the way we think, and to the economic structures which control everyone more and more. It's really a huge thing. And she dismantles neoclassical economics, as I do in my writings. She says the US and Europe are the models for neoclassical economics, but their growth resulted from the free use of the resources, the land and the labour of colonised people and the labour of women. Two of the difficulties of moving to a different economic system are force of habit and lack of understanding as to what constitutes a fair deal, how things are valued. Is an hour of advice from a lawyer worth so much more than an hour of childcare? I say in some of my writing that in my wild utopian dreams I want everybody paid the same per hour. After all, that's what Broadsheet did, the feminist magazine in Auckland. It actually did pay everybody from the editor to the cleaner the same per hour wage. Let's think about that as a possibility. I look back to what I was writing around 2002 when I came to think about what to say tonight, and found a paper from late 1999 when APEC was held in New Zealand, and I was pretty angry about the direction. We held a women's conference against APEC, Beware the Misleaders. Its main themes were Māori rights as Indigenous people, the impacts on women's paid work of globalisation, including low pay, outwork, contracting out, job losses in sectors such as the clothing industry, the more market approach in health and education, and biotechnology, genetic engineering and food safety. The culmination of the resistance was a conference where many New Zealand and overseas speakers demonstrated the realities of globalisation and the links to colonisation from Bougainville to the Philippines, from Korea to our own backyards. APEC was even sold on the government webpage to children, with games and material that included APEC is about making trade work better through open trade, simple trade rules, sharing ideas. How are our lives shaped by trade? We trade with people and places all over the world, so we have things to use in our everyday lives. Where in the world do the objects in your classroom come from? Well, free trade is a complete misnomer. I haven't got time to go into it more. The 6 high priority themes for economic and technical cooperation contain no mention of human or labour rights and only lip service to environmentally sustainable growth. The private sector arm published reports on the theme of APEC means business, which says it all. Then on capital flows, I said, worldwide there is increasing concern about speculative capital flows, now some 90% of the total flows of money in the world, as against only 10% a few years ago. Proposal for an international financial transaction tax suggested by James Tobin as long as 21 years ago then, 40 odd years ago now, have increasing support. Susan mentions the Tobin tax too as a worthwhile tool. Even George Soros, super speculator supreme, has said, although I've made a fortune on the financial markets, I now fear that the untrammeled intensification of laissez-faire capitalism and the spread of market values into all areas of life is endangering our open and democratic society. The main enemy of the open society, I believe, is no longer the communist but the capitalist threat. I don't think people realise that he has said that himself. I mean, when the largest 100 economies are half countries and half TNCs, Bill Gates owns more than 45% of all US households, and the largest 200 TNCs income is 29% of world GDP, it's not surprising. Well, all that was 20 years ago, and it's only got worse. Many Māori women are strong opponents of unfettered corporate-driven biotechnology. Ara Hamid, addressing a 1996 conference on plant biotechnology on the question of how the values of Māori would be considered and integrated in its use, recorded that this very nation was created because of the values of Māori, who found the concept of sharing these lands and resources quite acceptable, as long as there existed a constitutional code to articulate rights and responsibilities, regulate behaviours and accommodate access rights of settlers without compromising the guardianship ownership rights of Māori. If only. Well, I guess to expect much progress in 20 years is over-hopeful, especially given the 40,000-year biodiversity Susan envisaged based on Lila Watson's talk that she mentioned. But we have to be a bit impatient, given climate change, and we have to keep all the issues alive. I was asked a few years back to write about how I envisage a compassionate and sustainable economy. I've written out a great spiel from that, but I haven't got time to go into it. But I will finish by saying that such a compassionate economy would need huge changes to economic and financial systems built on growth, greed and speculation. It would serve a world where all its inhabitants were valued. I guess that's much the same as the end of Susan's book. A world filled with richness, depth, and a world which can survive sustainably for 40,000 years. That would be a real wild politics.
Thank you very much, Prue. Unfortunately, what you said, depressing as it is so very, very true. And just a reminder that we've also just published Vandana Shiva's autobiography, Terra Viva, and she deals with a lot of those things, which is not to say that they've gotten better, but at least we're writing about it. And I think what we can say for all of us, old as we may be, we still keep battling for a fairer world. And maybe, given that the climate is really about to collapse, I mean, maybe something big is going to happen and people will start a new revolution. Who knows, maybe. But before we get into this, it's my great pleasure to introduce the second speaker, third speaker really, after Susan and Prue, and that is Diane Bell, who is a feminist anthropologist and social justice advocate, and a dear friend, I should say. Among her many books are Daughters of the Dreaming, 1984, Narrandjeri Wuruwaran, A World That Is, Was, and Will Be, 1998, Kungung Narrandjeri Minimar Yunnan, Listen to Narrandjeri Women Speaking, 2007, and a novel, Evil, which needs to be reread, I reckon. She has held senior positions in higher education in Australia and the USA. After 17 years in the USA, she left when George Bush Jr. was re-elected. She always said she would, and she did. And 8 in South Australia, working with Narrandjeri and on environmental matters like the Murray-Darling Basin. She so-called retired to Canberra, where she continues to write, plot and plan and imagine a better world while being emerita professor of anthropology at the Australian National University, and importantly, kayaking on the Molonglo River. That's very important, even when it's freezing. Over to you, Di.
Thank you, Renate. And thank you, Prue. That was fantastic listening to you. Not a humble, radical feminist economist at all. Fantastic. A real a masterclass. Thank you. It's a delight to be part of launching the new edition of Wild Politics. It's a timely publication now and 20 years ago. Key concepts of biodiversity, connection, relationships, of reciprocity and groundedness of the local are brought into sharp focus by the feminist critiques of globalism, homogenisation, universalisation and neoliberalism, allowing us to reimagine the wild as a politics of hope. To the local. Ngunnawal, the people of Canberra. Let's begin with them, where we currently sit. I pay my respects to the Ngunnawal, past, present and future, on whose country I am currently living, and I acknowledge their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of Canberra and the region. I extend that respect to other Indigenous peoples participating in this launch and acknowledge the diversity of countries joining in this Zoom. And so, trying to find where my cursor is. And so, Yuma, hello. That's how the nightly ABC TV news begins in Ngunnawal country. Yuma. In June this year, on the 30th anniversary of the Mabo decision, the Ngunnawal Traditional Owners Network Group announced that they intended to lodge a native title claim over the ACT and parts of New South Wales. What cultural protocols might emerge? Who would welcome whom? Are we ready for the epistemological multiversity that would ensue? Wild politics indeed. Now today marks 50 years ago, on the 20th of July 1972, when the police tore down the tent embassy that Aboriginal people had erected on the lawns of Parliament House, an embassy to draw attention to the fact that they had no standing within their own nation. Violence ensued. The tent embassy was rebuilt. It was torn down by police. The tent embassy was rebuilt. It was on sovereign ground, never ceded. Many reforms followed that 1972 embassy, but a yawning gap remains. Now, in 2022, the Uluru Statement from the Heart beckons. Might we walk together to build a better future by establishing a First Nations voice to Parliament, enshrining it in the Constitution, establish a Makarrata Commission for the purpose of treaty making and truth-telling? Are we up for this journey? Literally, metaphorically? Make sure you keep your copy of Wild Politics in your knapsack. Track the connections. Now, if I was following the Ngunnawal experience, we might explore their history of the annual migrations of the bogon moths from the warmer lowlands of New South Wales and Queensland to the Tidbinbilla Ranges and Southern Alps, where, over the summer months, the moths estivate in the cool crevices of the rocky ledges and caves. For the Ngunnawal and neighbouring nations who feasted on the moths, this was a season of plenty, of ceremony, large gatherings. Early 19th century reports note the glowing health of the Ngunnawal. Even their dogs were glossy as they came down from the high country. I recall the dense moths swarming. They blocked out the moon. They clogged the business of Parliament House. They fused the lights of corporate headquarters. That was in the 1970s. Since the 1980s, with climate change, pesticides, and urban light pollution, the swarms have declined. But now, in 2017 and 2018, the species was described as undetectable, a decline of 99.5% from numbers that has been as high as 4.4 billion. The drought had taken their toll, not just of the moths. Ecologist Ken Green, who's been monitoring the bogon moths for the past 40 years, reports, in food chains, you have these flows of energy, And the bogor migration was a massive flow of high nutrients up into the mountains that helps those animals, birds, reptiles, other marsupials, that have survived the harsh winters to be fully fed for spring and summer. We can see the first cascade effects, like starving possums, pygmy possums, but who knows where these flow effects will end. Read what wide politics says about capital flows and market collapse. Reflect on the pandemic. What do we learn about supply chain? We live in a connected world made up of disconnected parts. If the principle of diversity applied, how might these invisible energy flows register on balance sheets? Clue. Central to the structure of Susan's research design is its experiential basis. How will we mourn the demise of the moth? The review of the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, released yesterday, is explicit. The Act has failed to safeguard Australia's vulnerable plants, animals, and ecological communities. The report highlights the importance of Indigenous knowledge, more symbolic rhetoric, or an embracing of a holistic philosophy. Ngunnawal traditional custodian Bradley Bell, who works for the ACT Environmental Directorate to help manage water health through cultural understanding, welcomed the opportunity for collaboration. I still have a lot to learn from mainstream, he said, but then I still have a lot to offer from a cultural perspective. The health of the environment, he emphasised, is part of Indigenous people's identity and spirituality. Watching the accelerated extinction of species, he said, is a source of pain. Read chapter 2 on power and knowledge, global monotony or local diversity. Note the deepening gap that Susan is mapping between transnational sector and her diversity matrix. The moth has a message for the proponents of the triple bottom line balancing, the people, planet, prosperity mantra. There is no future on a dead planet. The way in which damage to country registers on the body is encoded in Ngarrindjeri, the language of the people of the Lower Murray Lakes and Coorong of South Australia. In Ngarrindjeri, the word for land, the word for country, is rui. The word for body is rua. That is the plural of rui. Connections encoded in the language. In the mid-1990s, Ngarrindjeri women were the centre of a struggle to protect their sacred places about to be desecrated by the building of a bridge to Hindmarsh Island, which would facilitate access for a marina so large boats could go up and down the Coorong, waters of the Coorong. This is an area where fresh waters meet, where stories abound, where diverse species flourish. It's rich in meaning. The pylons of that bridge registered like a stake through the uterus. It was an assault on women's reproductive lives and an assault on the integrity of the country. Rui, Rua, land, body. Listen to the Ngarrindjeri naming their environment. Wetlands, places to be drained and replanted, become nurseries where life is nurtured. And Hindmarsh Island, it's called Kumarak, the place of pregnancy. Indigenous knowledge that maps the contours of country is as diverse as the land itself. One size does not fit all. The Jabberong of Western Victoria have 6 named seasons. Kuyang, late summer. It is the season of eels and parched landscape. Wangangmoron, autumn, the season of honeybees, sunrises and flocking birds. Chinook, winter, season of cockatoos, cool climate and early wildflowers. Laruk, early spring, season of nesting birds and changeable weather. Patkan, late spring, season of wildlife and wildflowers. Balambar, early summer, season of butterflies, warm weather and wetland plants. Jabberong traditions are an invitation to reconceptualise our collective relationship with nature, from dominance and control to connectivity, to see the possibilities in fire management regimes that are cognizant of the seasons, to know the song of the life-sustaining species such as the eels, to name the 6 seasons that echo the rhythms of the land, to map local ecologies and water management that nurture the old gums. This brings me to the matter of the incommensurability of key concepts in Indigenous languages. And I was thinking of Susan's long-standing interest in language, including Sanskrit, ancient Greece, and Latin, as I read her feminist critique of Western global culture, where she dissenters the logic that is currently dominating the world and introduces her diversity matrix. If you're not familiar with her playfulness with language, be prepared to be charmed. New terms are needed for this thinking. Outside the asili, a Swahili word, meaning the seed at the center of culture. Susan provides a paragraph to reorient the readers to this word, not just equals this, a whole paragraph. A number of the cultural concepts on which Susan draws are virtually untranslatable. An English rendering does violence to multivocal, context-dependent concepts. Learning to unlearn and relearn is part of her wild politics project for our planet. Susan alerts us to the assumptions that discourses of neoliberalism deploy to mask and mystify with a language of command and control. Try her semantic piracy. Now, Susan and I share an affection for the form of the manifesto, from the Latin manifestum, meaning clear or conspicuous. A manifesto is a rhetorical form well suited to sounding the death knell of patriarchy. It's an important feminist genre, short, sharp, to the point. It demands action. My goal is to make readers think, Susan says. I've been thinking about an ethics of care, as articulated in the increasingly sophisticated interrogations of justice, power, human rights, globalism, liberal and neoliberal economics by feminist ethicists. In my 2021 Feminist Manifesto, I explored care's complex relationship with hierarchies of gender. Women's embodied experiences of caregiving positions them as knowing subjects whose voices must be heeded by decision makers, not because of their gender per se, but because under patriarchy, care work is devalued, familial, not of public importance. In so doing, I was reorienting care as a practice and as a cluster of values that takes place in contexts of domination laid bare by the pandemic. In 2010, I wrote the Murray Mouth Manifesto, the Murray River being the major river system that drains the southeast of Australia. And in my manifesto, the Murray Mouth spoke, and it said to economists and engineers, "Your experts have measured, modelled and maddened me, and then brokered the results in the name of balance of interest. You survived the global financial crisis. Well done. Now for the global environmental crisis. I have reached peak water. The mouth is silted up. The river does not understand state boundaries, the constitutional heads of power. It does not understand forward estimates, especially ones that do not factor in climate change." Yesterday, Minister Plivosek, our new Minister for the Environment, speaking of the release of that State of the Environment report, revealed that of the commitment for 450 gigalitres, only 2 have been delivered since 2013. Who is taking care? In whose name? Wild Politics began as a 3-page manifesto, as Susan has told us. Much has changed, but the clarity of the moment shines through. Its poetic heartbeat is strong. Its affection for sustainability stems from, amongst other things, Susan's childhood experience of farming. The 3 pages grew to a PhD, and I'm very grateful for the scholarship that entailed. For one, it brought Susan to the USA in 2001, where she stayed with me in Washington while she read through the reports of the World Bank. For two, the breadth of her reading is breathtaking, and I notice Prue were using the same word for the breadth of her scholarship. Check out her bibliography and footnotes. Yes, radical feminists know how to cite their sources. When she writes that corporate globalism is an extreme form of masculinist domination, she has the case studies to support the proposition. As I read the acknowledgement pages of Wild Politics, I was reminded of the talented staff and team of editors, typewriters, proofreaders, and designers that ensure Spinifex publications are books we want to read, own, and quote. The standout in all of this is the remarkable couple at the core of the enterprise, Doctors Renate Klein and Susan Hawthorne. We are all in your debt. So finally, let me say thank you to Spinifex Press for being a brave beacon of what an independent publisher might be. The world Susan is calling into existence in her final sentence, I want a Wild Politics, is a world of richness, texture, depth and meaning, one replete with surprises, a world which can survive sustainability for at least 40,000 years, a world where fearless feminists flourish. Back to the local. When my Nurundjeri friends sign off, they say Nakan, which means see you later in the future. From my manifesto, hashtag organise, don't agonise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. Thank you also very much for the nice acknowledgement. We try. We really do try.
You do more than try. You succeed.
Yeah, well, we work very, very hard. So, but we also have fun occasionally. So now I want to hand back to Susan, who will explain to us why there is a second edition with this very beautiful cover, new cover that I'm sure you will all really like. I hope you can see it. So back to you, Susan.
Well, thank you, Renate. Thank you, Di. Thank you, Prue. Wow, I don't quite know what to say, but thank you. So why get out a new edition now? We were coming close to running out of copies. That's always a good reason. A second reason is that there are a number of UN COP meetings this year talking about having biodiversity actually at the center of them. So I thought, well, there was in 1992, there was the big biological diversity convention in Uruguay, was it? And that was before I started thinking about this, but I thought maybe now other people are also beginning to think about biodiversity and how important it is. And I thought, well, why not try? Why not put it out there? Perhaps there's more interest. I had great difficulty getting reviews for the book when it first came out. People, apart from those who were interested in it, many just said, oh, it's too complicated. And it probably is and was, but that's okay. Life is complicated. So Prue, you mentioned some of the things that have gotten better or worse. I mean, for the worst ones, the war, climate change, pollution, mad consumer culture that never stops, including a kind of culture that is selling women's and children's bodies in endlessly spiraling markets. And when I wrote the book, while the internet certainly existed, social media had not yet come in. I didn't join Facebook until 2009. I was a little bit late because I wasn't a teenager at the time. But that has really changed things. And perhaps I should have mentioned that. You're right, in the intro, in the preface, Prue, I should have mentioned social media, but maybe I did that in Vortex, which I published 2 years ago. So there is also more awareness about climate change, but only in the sense that if you hit over the head, you become aware of the hammer. It's happening over and over and over again, not just in one way. I mean, in terms of cyclones, fires, massive storms, coral bleaching, a whole range of different things going on in countries all around the world. I mean, who'd have thought that Britain would have a daily temperature of 40+ degrees? I mean, we don't think that's that unusual, but obviously for people living in Britain, it is huge. I think radical feminism is building internationally again. And again, it's a bit like the awareness of the hammer. because violence against women has really increased. The erasure of women through the transgenderist campaigns is also giving a focus to a lot of protest and activism, and a general atmosphere of woman hating that pervades our culture. So feminist, and particularly radical feminism, is growing because it has to. It has to, we have to deal with these changes that are coming on. And I hope that some of the ideas that I put forward in Wild Politics also answer some of those concerns. In the fields of forestry, fishing and farming, there are some inspiring new practices. Suzanne Simard's book about the fungus in the forests was truly remarkable, and I mention her in the preface about how the fungi under the ground maintain the health of a forest, but also the importance of practices of cultural burning to prevent catastrophic bushfires. And until the bushfire season of 1919-2020, I had not heard that discussed in the mainstream. I had certainly heard of it and knew about it, but only after those fires did it come into the mainstream. The incompatibility of plastics and oceans, including the reduction in single-use plastic bags, which has been happening in Queensland for some time. I don't think it's all around Australia, but obviously it should be, because there's far too much plastic floating around in the oceans. The growth of regenerative farming practices, organic farming, and a bit more of an increase in consumer awareness of reduction of food miles. But of course, also these things cost more, so it's not always possible for people to be able to afford such things. That's my dog shaking in the background. Biodiversity remains at the centre of my thinking. And I remember the day that I realised that biodiversity, we had to change our inspiration from money making and profiting to biodiversity, and suddenly all the bits just fell into place. And I thought, oh, this is a good idea. So when biodiversity makes possible a whole lot of things, like if you are inspired by biodiversity, there are some things you cannot do. You can't go to war. You can't clear fell a forest, because that's like making war against the forest. You can't sell women's bodies in porn, prostitution and surrogacy, or IVF and other biotechs, because that's a war against the bodies of women. You can't colonize other people and remove their culture and language, because that's a war against people who've been colonized. You can't push for disconnection from the earth and from the body, because that becomes a war on biology. And the transgenderist lobby is one of those, is playing a major part in that. But so are the transhumanists and the men who think that they can be immortal. You can live a feminist life. And I think that we must live a feminist life. You can live an ecological life, and each of us can play a part in that. But so too do the big boys need to start playing a part in that. And you can live a life sensitive to the cultures around you. I've long thought that everybody should learn at least one extra language, because it helps you see the world through a different lens. But even if you don't manage to learn a second language, you can still practice learning to see through other people's eyes. You can read books, you can read autobiographies and fiction and poetry. They also play a part. The way that relationships of reciprocity are more important than possession and profit. Our local knowledge and our connections are far more important than consumption and profit. To save the planet, we're going to have to be a lot more thoughtful and ethical, as you've both said in your talks. And my goal with this book was to make readers think, to imagine a different way of living with the earth and all its riches. And amongst those riches are the riches of knowing other people. So I'm going to stop there for the moment, although I should say there are a lot of photos in the book as well. And quite a lot of them were taken at what was called the S11 protest in Melbourne, which happened in 2000. And I spent 3 days at this protest, just wildly taking photos. The horses were used to move people away. Vandana Shiva came and spoke, but a whole lot of very big guns from the World Economic Forum, which is what it was. The protests were against the World Economic Forum. The big guns were there too. It was quite an exciting and rather moving experience to be there in a 3-day protest. So thank you. So if you, either of you would like to make any other comments, or if anybody wants to ask a question or whatever, that would be fine. Okay, well then.
You're too convincing. I can see nobody wants to disagree with you or Prue or die. It's just
Margot had something to say.
Margot. Yes. Hi, Margot.
Hey, hello.
Hi.
Oh, look, just thanks for all your work. And that's everybody who spoke, really. It's great to try and come to grips with, I don't know, feminist economics, if you want to reduce it to that. It's a bit wider than that, really, isn't it?
It is.
But I did just want to say, Susan, way back when you did your introduction, you made the point that has been made for many, many, many years now, which is absolutely always worth remaking, particularly when the speakers are white Western people, that it's not so much a problem of overpopulation as overconsumption, which, you know, I remember this is going back to the 70s with people just, if the, you know, basically what was being said was, if third world people if poor people didn't have so many kids, the problem would be solved, you know. So that's been this fabulous counter to that since then, you know. Hang on, let's look at the per capita consumption, you know, the entire of Bangladesh compared to the entire of Australia and whatever. But what I just would like to say is that I do think somehow, as well as emphasising that and never dropping that point, we do have to look at the overpopulation thing as well, particularly in these days. But obviously with great care, you know, I do think, this is my personal opinion, I do think we're overpopulated, and I do think it's a feminist issue. I do think it's to do with lack of women's access to birth control and control over their reproduction. I haven't worked in a third world country. I haven't worked with Aboriginal people, like some of you have, but I'll just bet that there's millions of women out there who would have less children if they were able to, or if they were able to access free abortions, or, you know, whatever the birth control methods are. I see it as a totally feminist question and an absolute tool of patriarchy. And you look at all of the patriarchal religions and governments, really, who have stymied access to birth control in a real way internationally for years. You know, they speak as one on this. This is what it seems like to me. So that's really kind of the point I wanted to make, which is, you know, I don't think it's just sufficient to say it's not really an overpopulation problem, it's an overconsumption problem. And I know that's not what you said, Susan.
Well, no, because the book began in Bangladesh at a conference called People's Perspectives on Population. I learned a lot. I heard a lot about it. And I also discovered that the figures were something back in around about 2000. The figures were something like that a person in a Western country would consume something like 39 times more than a person in Nepal or Bangladesh or similar kinds of places. So if you can cut out, and that's going to be more than that now, I think, if you can cut out the 39 times before starting on the other, then we probably would get some things happening. There have been some really interesting posts on social media recently. I mean, I read something about, you know, if men had to, you know, have appointments and wait a certain number of days and do this and do that and have a vasectomy and various other things, if they had to do that ahead of having sex, and the whole thing would change too. You know, I mean, it just, what I liked about that was it turned it on its head and said, no, women are not responsible for this kind of thing happening. Men have to change their behavior too. And I'm often looking for things that turn your mind around, make you think differently. And I think going to Bangladesh certainly did that for me. I mean, as I said, the kind of the fertility of the land just struck me as extraordinary. I saw huge piles of cauliflowers and cabbage and other vegetables by the road. And, you know, I mean, and as well as that, people, lots and lots of people, you know, working. Whereas, you know, where I grew up in the country, you saw a tractor in the distance. You might, you know, you see a big wheat field or, you know, something like that. It was a different kind, you know, so that in that sense, it also turned my head around. But I accept what you're saying, but I think we need to work on the consumption first, because I think that it could possibly be easier. And of course, if women had access to safe contraceptives, safe and free abortion when it was needed, not being forced into it, and those sorts of things, that would also make massive changes. And a lot of this also has to do simply with the fact that women are the poorest group in the world across all spectra. You know, poverty is something that goes along with being a woman very frequently. So
yeah, I guess I just don't see it as first or second order. Like I just see
well, I think we have to do everything all at once. We have to do
both.
We have to do everything all at once. And yeah, I don't know.
And if the number of children that women had was totally under their control, I bet the population would be different.
Yes, I agree with you on that.
But it's not on women's control. It's
no, I know,
men,
that's what I'm saying.
You know, it's men who force themselves on women. And how do you stop men violating women? That's, I think, you know, one of the very, very big questions. And you see, just in Australia, 2 women get murdered. What is it, every 2 weeks? And everybody says, "Ooh, it's terrible," but nothing changes. Despite all the new orders and all the new ideas, nothing changes. And in fact, it was recently that I think it was Anne Summers, who was not a particular great friend of mine, but she said on a Q&A, we have to stop us talking about women. We have to start talking about men.
Yeah.
You know, they have to change their behavior. Now, how do we make men change their behavior? Very, very, very difficult. And one of the next books we're publishing is a book actually how women are terrorized by men who use pornography. And don't we all know that, pornography is just everybody uses it, it's no big deal. Well, it was a very, very big deal for these women. And girls and boys are introduced into a kind of sexuality in which porn is the role model. And the role model means that women are being degraded they're being choked, they're being terrorized, they're being humiliated, they're being exploited. That is, I think, one thing that we really, really also have to turn our attention to. And we would have fewer children if women had more power. And it comes back to that, I think.
Mhm.
That's what I'm saying. I think it's a feminist question that has to be addressed. And
Absolutely.
I totally agree that we've got to put the men, like I don't say, what I say about the current abortion stuff, are you pro or against abortion? It's the wrong question. The question is, why does any woman get pregnant when she doesn't want to be?
Exactly. Yes.
You know,
yes.
that's the question.
Yeah. Yeah.
But of course,
The other, oh, sorry, go ahead, Prue.
well, I was going to say, but of course, we are actually under two children per woman in most of the developed world, and,
Yes.
Yes.
and already, and it's the overconsumption. I agree with Susan. It's overconsumption that's the major thing. Surely in the third world, some of it is short life expectancy. You've still got to have kids to bring up the next generation, for the next generation to last well enough. And it's, of course, we want to slow down the population growth in some of those countries, but I really think it's the overconsumption that's to blame. I think we only have to think about trying to make life far better for women, of course, everywhere. But I don't think that having too many children is the worst thing.
The other part of that puzzle is that is infant mortality and women having more children because that's their care as they get older. And if your children aren't going to survive infancy, you keep having children. Where you get good infant care
Yep.
and pre and postnatal care, so
Yep.
a
Yep.
holistic health, women will look to limit their families. But if you don't think your kids are going to survive and your kinship structure and culture is built on having children that look after you and are part of your productive unit, then you keep having children. So it's not just, the point of conception, it's how children are cared for and how mothers are cared for.
And
What they mean for the social
another-
security, your social security in old age.
That's what I'm saying.
And
That's what-
Yeah.
on another matter, Four Corners last night, which was about plastic surgery and various other things being carried out, particularly on young women, but also some young men. This is a consumption thing. And
In China.
In China, yes. And I was just horrified at the way in which, something like that is spreading into China. And China is also a country that needs children to support the older people, their grandmothers and grandfathers.
Right.
So it's incredibly problematic. But I was intrigued by the program last night because it didn't actually, it problematized it to some extent, but it didn't talk about the kind of macro side of it, which I think it should have. But still, it was certainly interesting, and it's a new form of consumption. And you see it also in India when you travel to India these days, that the level of consumption has really gone up. But there's massive consumption in one building, and behind the building there are slums, and the people who live in the slums are the cleaners and the other people who come in at night and make the consumption for the wealthy possible. So, yeah.
Okay, are there any more hands up or any more questions that women want to ask?
There is somebody saying, on another tangent, I view grass lawns as a colonialist importation, a public display of land ownership. Yes, and you see that with the golf courses, don't you? I sort of half grew up on a golf course because my parents like to play golf. But I find golf courses really problematic. And yes, they do spread a whole lot of exotics into into a land that is not intended for that. But yeah.
We should thank you. We should thank you for this launch. We should thank Spinifex for being here, all the people who participated. What will we do without you?
And I wanted to say some thank yous as well. So Diane and Prue, both of you enabled me to call myself Dr. Hawthorne. Thank you.
Look what we unleashed.
and your work was an inspiration for a great deal of what I write about in Wild Politics. So thank you for being prepared to come and revisit it this evening. To Farida Akhtar, Maria Mies, Jenna Correa and Renate Klein for their part in the development of this book. Without them, I wouldn't have started. I just would have left it at 3 pages and thought, wasn't that fun? Yeah, it was quite a journey, but I enjoyed it. To everybody at Spinifex Press, to Pauline Hopkins, who insisted that I have a launch, Marilyn Damiano, office manager, and Danielle Osborne, also in the office, Sharon Murphy, the warehouse manager, Rachel McDermott, marketing manager, and without whom these Zooms would not work as smoothly. Caitlin for endless social media posts, and of course, Renate Klein, my dedicated publisher and partner, without whom I could not have travelled to Bangladesh and many other places. And to all of you who come tonight, as well as those of you who've invited me to conferences and talks and winter institutes and discussed with me the ideas in Wild Politics. And I have to thank the 3 dogs as well, who've kept me walking. River, who oversaw the PhD, Freya, who was a marvellous dog, just truly amazing, and Nala, who's managing to keep me on my toes now, and yeah, she's a one-off. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time in coming. And to anybody who's watching the Zoom, thank you.
And of course, as one of the publishers, I have to say, and of course, go and buy the book and also recommend it to other people, because these ideas really need to be spread. All right, well, these are my final words, and thank you to all very much, and also to Rachel for keeping everything going. Thank you very much.
And Rachel,
bye. Have a nice evening.
We're just going to show how you can buy the book now. With the information on the shared screen. So you can buy the book directly from us. It's also available in the US from ipgbook.com and in the US Gazelle Book Services. And if you're in New Zealand, you can get it through us at Spinifex in Australia. And it is available through some other places in New Zealand.
And if you're in Australia, if you put in free post,
oh yeah,
it will be free postage in Australia. You have to put that in this when you order online.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, great.
Who knew?
And of course, it's also on some of the online booksellers that we won't name, but you all know who they are. But, you know, our books are there because we have to. Yes.
You crack me up, Renate.
Okay.
But it's true.
I'm going
All right, well,
to stop recording. So